Well, in today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the most exciting projects I think Word on Fire has ever undertaken. We've been working on it for months here, and it's been very difficult not sharing it with the world until now because we're all so passionate about it. So the easiest way to get into it is just to describe its origin. So Bishop, the whole Catholic Church has gone through this lacerating sexual abuse scandal that has undermined and harmed the church and basically every one of its dimensions. Anybody watching this knows what I'm talking about, from the revelations of then Cardinal McCarrick to the Pennsylvania grand jury report to numerous sexual abuse revelations that have come out since then. The church has just been spiraling into near despair. And so in light of that, you sat down and you wrote a new book. This is a book titled Letter to a Suffering Church. If you're watching the video version, you'll see a picture of it here on the screen. Letter to a Suffering Church, a Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. It's about 125 pages, so it's fairly lengthy, but you could still read the whole thing in maybe an hour, hour and a half. And we're going to talk about this book throughout the rest of the episode. But before we do, I wanted to highlight a couple of key facts about this book. So our goal is to get this book out to as many Catholics as possible. And to do that, we're trying to make it as cost effective as possible so as many people can get it as we can help them. So here's the deal. If you go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter, wordonfireshow.com/letter, you can get one copy of the book for free as long as you cover the shipping and handling. This is only for U.S. residents. If you're an international resident, you'll go to that site and you'll find out how you can get a digital version. But for U.S. residents, go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free print copy of the book as long as you cover the shipping. But here's the better part. If you are in a parish or in a larger small group, if you order 20 or more copies, you get the books for just $1 a copy with free shipping. $1 a copy with free shipping. So for 20 books, it's about $20. 100 books, about $100, and so on and so forth. So we encourage you to get these books for your parish and pass them out. If you're a pastor, a priest, a parish staff member, get this book for every person in their parish to give them hope, encouragement, and edification. I'll talk a little bit later in the podcast about all the extra resources we're giving you to make this effective. For example, a parish launch kit to help you launch this into your parish, an FAQ guide for priests and pastoral staff, and a 5-part video series from Bishop Barron that goes along with the book. So this is just the introductory announcement to get your book now. wordonfireshow.com/letter. Okay, Bishop, I want to spend the rest of this episode talking about what's in this book because it's just launching today, Monday, May 13th. Few people know about it yet, so I wanted to give people an overview of what's inside. So in the preface, you begin by saying, I'm not speaking in the name of my brother bishops or the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops or the Vatican. I have no authority to do so. I'm speaking in my own name as a Catholic, a priest, and a bishop. You also describe the book as a cry from the heart. It's not just sort of a bland, hollow, administrative statement. It's a real cry from your own heart. So what moved you? What compelled you to write this book in this style?
Yeah, I think, Brandon, it goes back to last summer when you and I sat down. Remember, I just was back from Ireland, and we did 2 videos on this whole issue. And those videos were really kind of a cri de coeur, as the French say, a cry from the heart. And they got a very strong reaction from people. And I think you and I began talking at that stage about maybe getting those in some kind of print form. So it's been percolating for a while. And what I wanted to do was write. It's a book, as you've been saying correctly. And actually, I haven't even seen the final version, the number of pages. But it's really a letter. And that's what it's called, a letter to a suffering church. I want it to be something that's substantive, but can be read, in 1 or 2 sittings maybe. But it was coming, you're right, out of my kind of pastoral heart. As I say there, I have no authority. I'm not speaking for the bishops. I mean, I don't have that authority. I'm not speaking for the Vatican. This is not any kind of official statement. It's simply my statement. But coming, I would say, out of, my whole life as a Catholic, 33 years as a priest, now almost 4 years as a bishop. This crisis has been, and I like that word you use, I think it was Cardinal DiNardo used it first, lacerating. It's been lacerating for the whole church, but for those of us in pastoral ministry, it has been. And it was just my pastor's heart, I think, that wanted to say something to the people of God. And the target audience of this book, even though I'm happy if non-Catholics, listen in, but the target audience is Catholics. And the image I have, Brandon, is in the wake of the McCarrick scandals last summer and fall. The number of times in my region out here in Santa Barbara, I'd go around to parishes, and there I'd stand with my, mitre and crosier, and I'm fully symbolizing the church. The number of people that came up to me, not so much in anger, but in deep grief, I would say, with tears in their eyes, grief over the church. And the book, the letter, is my attempt to respond to that pastoral need. So it's no more and no less than that, I would say. I don't want people to read it as, oh, this is the official statement of the American bishops. Nothing of the kind. I mean, I don't have authority to do that. But it's from my own pastor's heart, I would say.
I know all of us at Word on Fire were deeply concerned when this new survey came out from Gallup, one of the largest religious sociological groups in the country. And it revealed that 37% of American Catholics, 37% of Americans who identify as Catholic, who say I'm Catholic, have considered leaving the church as a result of these sexual abuse revelations. Now, they go deeper, and that number changes depending on how often you go to Mass, predictably, all that kind of stuff. But the simple fact that almost 40% of our own people are sitting on the fence, and they're thinking, maybe I should go, maybe I should stay. It seems like those are the people that you want to draw back to the church.
Yeah, I mean, I got it when I read that survey. I got it, but it broke my heart at the same time. I say it bluntly in the book. There's never a good reason to leave the Catholic Church. Now, again, I understand emotionally. I understand why people feel deep frustration. I feel it. But there's never a good reason to absent oneself from the font of grace. I mean, to leave the mystical body of Jesus. There's never a good reason for that. I don't care how badly church people behave. I don't care how grave the sin is on the part of church people. There's never a good reason to leave. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to make that case, is to say that, yes, this exists, this terrible, lacerating crisis. Yes, we have to be absolutely clear-eyed about it. But no, it's never a legitimate reason for leaving the church. In some ways, the book turns on those two hinges, I think.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. Bishop Barron just released this book today. You can get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free copy mailed to you as long as you cover the shipping, or you can buy bulk copies for your whole parish or your group for just $1 a copy with free shipping. So wordonfireshow.com/letter. Bishop, the book has 5 chapters, and I want to spend time talking about...
Before we start, Brandon, can I just say a word? Because, yes, we want this book to get out. I want it to be widely read. But, we've been very strong on this, that we're not making a penny of money on this book. We're trying to make it, first of all, as available as possible, right? As cheaply as possible. We've done that through various means. But secondly, any profit that might be derived from the sale of this book is going to go automatically, immediately into charities dedicated to helping victims of sexual abuse. And I just want people to be really clear about that, because the last thing in the world we wanted to do was give the impression that we're, trying to make money off of this terrible time in the church. The goal is simply to get it out to as many people as possible.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks. Also, anybody who knows anything about printing and shipping books knows that if you offer a book for $1 a copy, that's far less than it costs to print and ship books out. So we've also been helped by generous donors who have helped get the cost down, because they believe in this mission of getting the book out through parishes to as many people as possible. Good. Okay, well, before we dive into each of these 5 chapters, one more question. What do you think sets this book apart from other statements about the abuse crisis? And I don't just mean from other bishops, but multiple journalists and stories and articles and books and blogs, have covered the abuse crisis from so many angles. What sets your book apart?
Well, what I always found, Brandon, was missing in so many of the accounts, and as indispensable as they are, so don't get me wrong, that we analyze this thing from a sociological, cultural, psychological, legal standpoint, all that remains indispensably valuable. But what I often found missing was a a theological and spiritual and biblical reading of this crisis. And maybe if I could say one of the original elements in this book is the section where I go into the Bible and how the Bible sheds considerable light on this problem of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. But I'm trying to read it from a consistently spiritual and theological standpoint without eschewing for a minute those other points of view, but that's not my focus. And I think that's the novelty of this book.
All right, so let's go through each of the 5 chapters in the book, Letter to a Suffering Church. Chapter 1 is titled The Devil's Masterpiece. What do you talk about there?
That's a phrase I used, I think, when we had those videos, right, last summer. I might have used that phrase kind of spontaneously, a diabolical masterpiece, because I don't think it's possible to read this crisis simply from a natural or purely human standpoint. To me, in its destructiveness, in its comprehensiveness, it's just too well thought through. I've often said, if you were trying to find the best way to undermine the church in every aspect of its life, I challenge you to come up with a better plan than this one. I just don't think an appeal to the purely natural is sufficient to account for how devastatingly destructive this has been. And I've been, very influenced too by the Pope's insistence that we read this thing spiritually. The devil is described as the enemy of the human race, but more specifically, the enemy of the church. I mean, the devil hates the church because the church is trying to bring people to Christ. If you're this very powerful and deeply intelligent spiritual being, what are you going to come up with? It seems to me this crisis has been a diabolical masterpiece. It's a masterwork of wicked undermining of the church's life. So I begin with that observation. Now, I'm very quick to point out, because anticipating sort of dualistic critiques. The minute you invoke the devil, people say, "Oh, well, isn't that convenient? The devil did it, and we have nothing to do with it." Well, of course not. I mean, of course not. There's a kind of it's a perverse simulacrum of the way we cooperate with God's grace, right? God's grace awakens our cooperation. Well, in a similar way, it's a perverse simulacrum, but the devil calls forth our cooperation, and he does so typically through insinuation, through temptation, through suggestion, etc. And I use the example of the wonderful fresco of the Antichrist in Orvieto, Luca Signorelli's masterpiece of the devil putting his arm through the vesture of the Antichrist in such a way that it looks for all the world like it's the Antichrist's arm, but in fact it's the devil's. That hits very well, catches very well how this dynamic unfolds. So to say it's a diabolical masterpiece is not for a second to say that we weren't very involved in it, that human beings in their sinfulness were very involved. It's a both and, not an either or.
Why is it so important to recognize the devil's role in this abuse crisis? Why can't we just say, oh, it's just a bunch of wicked men? Why is his role significant?
Because we won't understand it and therefore be able to respond to it adequately unless we are fully honest about it. That's why we anticipate the end of the book, the way forward. A lot of it is a spiritual renewal of the church. It's not just let's get our legal situation in better shape. Let's just improve our psychological screening and formation. Again, as important as those are, I'm not gainsaying either one for one moment. Don't get me wrong, but that's not enough. That what's called for ultimately is a spiritual renewal and an acknowledgement that we're involved in a struggle. Right, in a spiritual warfare. And I think that's key to understanding this crisis in its complexity.
So that was chapter 1, The Devil's Masterpiece. Chapter 2 is titled Light from Scripture. What can the Bible teach us in regards to this crisis?
And I think here, Brandon, a lot of people might be surprised how clear-eyed the Bible is about this problem. Now, it's complex. The Bible is deeply appreciative of the role of human sexuality. The Bible's not a puritanical text. I've said 1,000 times. It's not a dualistic text. From the very beginning, God created all things spiritual and material, found them all very good. And furthermore, go forth and multiply, right, is one of the great commands of the Bible. In fact, whenever the covenant gets ratified throughout the Old Testament, it's usually accompanied by this command to go forth and multiply. Marriage, sexuality, family, the joy of sex, all of that is frankly celebrated by the Bible. It's part of God's great plan. Okay, now there's a shadow side because the Bible, as I say, is so clear-eyed about the myriad ways that we human beings tend to get off kilter, right? Well, sex and family and so on are so beautiful that when they get off kilter, they become deeply corrupt, right? And so we find that in the Bible. And this might surprise people, but walk your way through the Bible, Old Testament and New, you'll find lots of references to this problem. One that always comes to my mind because I develop it a bit in the book. It's such a clear, distant mirror, if I can use Barbara Tuchman's famous phrase, that we look at this story and we see ourselves, but a long, long time ago. The story of Eli the high priest and his sons Hophni and Phinehas, priests, right? And Hophni and Phinehas, deeply corrupt, both financially and sexually, abusing their people. Complaints are brought to Eli, the high priest. He pays lip service to it and urges the sons to, get it together, but they don't, and he doesn't follow up. And the result of this corruption, both the actual abuse and the overlooking of the abuse by an authority figure, Eli, the result is disaster for Israel. The loss of the ark, the loss of 30,000 soldiers, the loss of their political prestige, and the loss of life. Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli all are killed, right? Or the two sons are killed. Eli dies when he hears the news. Now, my point is, that story should sound pretty familiar to us in the last 25 years, right? Bad priests abusing their people, complaints brought forward to authority figures who say nice things but don't do very much. The result, disaster for the new Israel that we call the church. So I talk about that story and a number of others too. And then Jesus, I culminate with the Lord Jesus himself and the importance of children for Jesus as signs of the kingdom. Jesus putting his arm, that beautiful image, around the little child. Unless you change and become like one of these, unless you welcome, he who welcomes him welcomes me and welcomes him who sent me, etc. That children who were kind of marginal figures in Old Testament or in biblical times are brought so central by Jesus. So anyway, I develop a number of these things in that chapter. And I think as I look at this issue and the treatment of it, I don't find that very often, the biblical light being shed. So I think that's a helpful, perspective.
So that's chapter number 2, Light from Scripture. Chapter number 3 is titled, We Have Been Here Before. What's your purpose in this chapter?
Yeah, I start there with, he's still alive, my old church history professor, Father Charlie Meyer, taught generations of Chicago priests, including my own generation. And Charlie was a brilliant guy and loved taking us through the glories of church history. But he also took a kind of, I think, devilish delight in also showing us a lot of the corruption in church history, the corrupt priests and monks and popes, etc. And as I say in the book, for a lot of us who were kind of novices at that time, it was a little bit shocking. We had perhaps a naive, somewhat romantic view of the church and all these glorious figures. But then to hear of the deep corruption, even on the part of church leaders. But what I argue there is that in a way it was a very good immunization, if you want, is I got immunized by Charlie Meyer against being too scandalized. That, all right, the church has had bad people, even in very high positions, who've done terrible things. But we've survived. And in fact, in many cases, the corruption called forth the renewal associated with the really great figures in church history. It's not to excuse the corruption for a second, but it's to show somehow in God's providence, as the bark of Peter makes its way through the stormy waters, it's got, a lot of ups and downs. And so it's not to marginalize or to minimize what's happening now by any means, but it's to put it in a wider context. I also spent a little bit of time there with the famous Peter Damian story from the 11th century. St. Peter Damian, right? Great hermit and mystic and scholar and so on. But Peter Damian is famous for raising his very eloquent and strong voice against precisely sexual corruption in the church and on the part of high church leaders who were taking advantage of seminary and young priests. And again, talk about a distant mirror. You say the McCarrick crisis from last summer. Look back over 1,000 years in history. You'll see a distant mirror of the same thing. So I think it's helpful just to see what the body of Christ has endured over the centuries and how, despite all that, we've managed to survive. That's an important lesson, I think.
So that's chapter 3. We have been here before. Chapter 4 is when I think your blood really starts flowing. You get really excited and passionate because this one's titled, Why Should We Stay? I mentioned earlier that statistic from the Gallup survey that said 37% of American Catholics are considering leaving. Why should they stay? Why should they not leave the church?
Because we got a treasure in earthen vessels. So I use the Pauline image there as my master metaphor. And how helpful that at the very beginning of the church, Paul gave us that metaphor. The earthen vessels are obvious. It's us, right? The church. We're flawed. We're fragile. We're very breakable. But strangely, in those earthen vessels, there is a treasure, and the treasure is Christ. And the church, despite its failures and its fragility and its flaws, has borne that treasure up and down the centuries. Now, where do you find it? Well, you find it in the scriptures that have been preserved and commented upon by the church. You find it in the liturgy of the church. You find it in the sacraments. You find it especially in the Eucharist. You find it in the lives of the saints. You find it in the great works of art that the church has propagated and so on. In all these ways, the treasure is on display, and it's because of the treasure that we stay. What we should never do is say, oh, look at all these fragile, broken vessels. Well, yeah, from Paul's time on, we should expect a lot of broken, fragile vessels. But we don't stay because of the vessels. We stay because of the treasure. And I want people not to be so preoccupied with the fragility of the vessels that they overlook what's on offer and what is still on offer, which are all the things I mentioned, and more. And that's why I say there's never a good reason to leave the church. Well, they're all so corrupt. Everyone, it seems to be so. Yeah, but the Eucharist. Well, there's all these sins. Yeah, but Christ made available in the sacraments. Oh, these priests and bishops have been so. Yeah, but salvation offered. See, so the but there is the insistence upon the treasure that persists despite the fragility of the vessels.
All right, let's talk about the 5th and final chapter. This one is titled The Way Forward. And I know a lot of people getting this book are going to flip right to that chapter because they're going to say, okay, I'm with you. We should stay. Corrupt men in the church aren't good reasons to leave. But what do? We still got to do something to reform the church, to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again. What do you propose in this 5th and final chapter?
Well, Brandon, one thing I do there is to insist upon something that the church has done a great deal in terms of protocols and reforms and laws and so on. And I talk briefly, but I talk about the 2002 Dallas Accords, right? In the wake of the first wave of this great scandal, the church did respond with extraordinarily good and effective protocols. And I say that not just because I'm a Catholic bishop, but because you can prove it statistically that after 2002, when these protocols were in place, the number of abuse cases, fell off the table. And just analyze any of the statistics there of this thing peaking, in the 1970s, maybe early 1980s, trending downward, but then downward precipitously after 2002. So I think we have to give full credit to the Dallas Accords. I was a seminary rector, and so the Dallas Accords very much affected my work because we're screening candidates. Well, the background checks, and you're at the level of like FBI kind of background checks of these students, the psychological exams, the number of interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The institutional awareness of this problem, I would say, is so clear. I subscribe to the view, many have said this, but I don't know any institution in the world right now where children are safer from this point of view than the Catholic Church because of these protocols. So anyway, I spend a good deal of time insisting upon that. But I then add, and go back to the beginning of the book now, it's not just a matter of protocols, as indispensable as they are. It's also a matter of real spiritual reform. And I use kind of blunt, frank language first about the priesthood, that who can deny, and this is not a blanket condemnation, and the vast majority of priests are good and decent men and so on, but that there was some kind of rot in the priesthood that allowed this abuse to happen. And you can look at that in a number of levels, both the abuse itself, but also the kind of overlooking of the abuse or looking the other way, not taking it with sufficient seriousness. What was it in far too many priests and bishops that kind of allowed this thing to unfold? I make some suggestions there about how the priesthood has to be renewed. But also, and again, this is not to say, hey, we're all equally to blame. That's not the case. I'm not denying for a second how central the corruption of the clergy is here. But clergy don't come out of a vacuum, right? They come up out of a culture. They come up out of, in the vast majority of cases, Catholic families. Is there a need for the whole church to be renewed? Yeah, it seems to me. A rededication to prayer, a rededication to the sacraments, a rededication to life in Christ. Have we allowed ourselves as a church in its totality to drift away from Christ? And I think the answer there is clearly yes. So I make some more suggestions there about how the church as a whole should be spiritually renewed. So that's the way forward. It is laws and protocols, et cetera. But more deeply, this was the case when St. Francis called for reform, when St. Dominic called for reform, when Ignatius of Loyola called for reform. It's a spiritual renovation that matters above all.
Well, we're hoping that this new book, Letter to a Suffering Church, gets into the hands of millions of Catholics all over the country, Bishop. But if you could just say one thing to the Catholic Church in America, one rousing word when it comes to the sexual abuse crisis as a pastor, as a bishop, what one thing would you like to say to them?
I'd say stay and fight. And in fact, we were thinking about titles for the book. That was actually a title we thought about. Stay and fight. This is not the time to leave. So I understand the 37%. And again, I understand it. I get it. I'm not trying to undermine that point of view. I get it. But this is not the time to leave. It's the time precisely to stay and to fight for what's best and right in the church. I use the example, I think we did it in our video last summer of Lincoln. It was a great hero of mine. Where there are many people at the time of the Civil War, especially once the war got really dicey, and people were dying in their tens of thousands, who were saying, "Oh, come on, let's just get out of this thing. Let's end this goofy war and let the South have their way, and let's just end the fight." And Lincoln's genius, was to, despite all that opposition, despite the terrible quality of the struggle, to say, no, we have to hang in there and fight, because he saw the institution of slavery as a fundamental undermining of the very nature of American democracy, in a way that this rot that's in the church is undermining what we're supposed to be. All right, fight it, stay, redouble efforts. This is not the time to leave, but to stay and fight. That'd be my last word to Catholics.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. You can get a free copy if you cover the shipping at wordonfireshow.com/letter. But more importantly, we're encouraging you, please invite your parish to get copies for everyone in your parish community. You can get them for just $1 a copy with free shipping. All profits from the sale of this book go to charities that serve people who have been sexually abused. So we think this project is just win-win-win all the way around. We want to help the church and we want to help the victims. So please get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. Well, that sound means it is time for a question from one of our listeners. And today we have a question from Bob, who lives in North Carolina, and he's asking about what the church teaches about revelation, whether it's something that happened once or something that's ongoing. So here's Bob's question.
Hey, Bishop Barron, this is Bob from North Carolina. Our parish here is currently doing the study guide for the Mass, and one of the things that it talked about when it pushed us back towards the Catechism was a term called amnesis, which I believe is something that is a Platonic from Plato type term. My question is, if we start with Plato and we learn from those things, and that grows into the Old Testament and that leads to the New Testament, does the church feel like we're really there yet, or are we continuing to evolve and still having things revealed to us even today? Thank you very much.
Good. That's a searching question. First, anamnesis, word meaning memory, it's a Greek term, obviously, but it's not derived so much from Plato's sense, which is it's used in an epistemological context for Plato, that when we come to know something, we're actually remembering, what we knew when we lived in the realm of the form. So they're not using it in that way. Biblically, it's much more of a Jewish term. And it's the idea of the recuperation of history is not just a distant recalling, but a real participation in. So just that clarification, the anamnesis in question is not Platonic, it's much more biblical. But to your point, has the church used Platonic philosophy? Yeah, read everybody from Justin Martyr through Augustine of Hippo, and you find a lot of our major players using Platonic philosophy to explicate Christian theology. Can we use Aristotle? Famously, Aquinas does. Can we use all kinds of other people, as John Henry Newman used Locke and Hume, etc.? Sure. That's the Catholic genius. It's part of the both and faith and reason, but also the Newman idea of the development of doctrine. So it doesn't mean that new doctrines are coming. So revelation, in one very important sense, is closed. It ended with the last book of the New Testament. That's when formal revelation ended. We're not expecting anything new to come at that level. However, what was given to us is like a seed that's now going to grow into a great tree. It's like the beginning of a river that's now going to unfold. Part of that unfolding process is indeed the use of whatever cultural forms we might find expedient to that purpose. So that's part of the Catholic genius. We don't get new doctrines, but doctrine unfolds, and it can do so through the influence of philosophy and so on. That's a very, very quick answer to your question that requires really a whole course in fundamental theology.
Well, before we wrap up here, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about our new way of supporting the podcast through Patreon, and we have a lot of patrons who have joined and wanted to be a part of helping out this show. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to several patrons who have donated at significant levels. They include Eric Hansen, Jacqueline Yoder, James Siddlington, Jamie Capetta, John Brenton, John Mattini, Juan Solaris, Karen Perry, Mark Rogers, Matt Gamble. All of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. On behalf of Bishop Barron, the whole Word on Fire team, we're so grateful for your support in helping get this show out to more people. So to all of you and to all of our patrons, I wanted to just express thanks on this episode and all future episodes as well. Well, one final reminder here before we wrap up, get your copy of the new book. Again, it's called Letter to a Suffering Church by Bishop Barron. Just came out today. You can get your copy by visiting wordonfireshow.com/letter. Get one free copy for yourself, but then more importantly, share it with your pastor, share it with your parish staff, encourage them to get copies for your whole parish. You can get them for just $1 a copy plus free shipping. All of the proceeds go to support charities that minister to victims of sexual abuse. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.